Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and welcome to vlog 110, The Deal Breakers. This is the concluding vlog in our information literacy trilogy, and in some ways it's ironic, it's sort of the ending, because this is where we started from, if you remember, because I've been reading a lot of PhDs recently, a hell of a lot of PhDs, and I've seen time and time again these deal breaker corrections. So I thought we would do a vlog on it, but we would start more buoyantly and optimistically by looking at information literacy more generally, and of course grey literature. So finally we're here. So I'm going to do a vlog with really one job. You had one job, I have one job, let me do it. I want to show to you the deal breaker referencing corrections that undermine your credibility. Now, I've been doing a lot of the really current research on the examination process with the PhD in the last few weeks, just to check and verify that what I have been arguing and showing through my research in the last 15 years about examination is still current and it's still true, and yes it is. So the research I've been finding in the last couple of years or so is revealing a very, very interesting outcome. It's showing that examiners, all of us as PhD examiners, approach the PhD wanting the student to succeed, wanting the PhD to pass. So we come to it in a really optimistic and buoyant way. But what the new research is showing, and this was quite remarkable I thought, what the new research is showing is the speed at which examiners' expectations and hopes about a good PhD start to tumble down the ranking and the grading. So when an examiner looks at the bibliography or reference list and even looks at the first couple of chapters, their expectations and their grade tumbles at speed. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to give you the deal breaker corrections so you can actually address them and fix them so that the examiner does not find them and they remain buoyant and optimistic. Now, ironically, the most famous statement, the most oft quoted phrase I've ever written hasn't come from my books and hasn't come from my refereed articles. No, it's come from a piece of journalism. And the most famous statement I've ever written is I described a bibliography as the canary in the PhD coal mine. So the bibliography is the canary in the PhD coal mine. So that was a metaphor, it was a trope, but also it was a very significant way of thinking about the relationship between the PhD and its bibliography. So what did that metaphor actually mean? Well, in the mining industry, miners used to carry with them a canary in a cage, because the canary has a higher problematic tolerance, if you will, with carbon monoxide. So when the carbon monoxide level would increase in the mine, the canary would die, so the miners would know to get the hell out of that mine pretty damn quickly. So the canary in the coal mine, it is the first warning sign that something is going wrong. Very, very wrong. So it is the same with the bibliography and the PhD. If you are going to have an untimely ending in terms of your examination process and the grading, it will be revealed quickly and first in your bibliography or reference list. So what I'm going to do today, 9 quick tips, 9 quick key errors, 9 of these canaries in the coal mine that examiners pick up that gets them worried, gets them concerned that something is going wrong. So when I see these 9 issues, I know that the student is in trouble, but the weird thing for you guys is these are really straightforward errors. So if you simply look at this list, think about this video, maybe stop the video after each of these 9 deal breaker corrections, and then you can just check, is that in existence in my thesis, and correct them. We're golden, we're good to go. So the first point is, please always remember that the overwhelming majority of examiners start reading your PhD from the back. So the first thing we look at, we flick through, is the bibliography and the reference list. And pretty well I know if a student is going to pass or fail, major corrections, minor corrections, revise and resubmit, from that bibliography. So let's get into those 9 deal breakers. Okay, let's do this. Let's do it quickly so that examiners do not find these errors in your work. So 1, deal breaker 1, size of the reference list. The bigger the bibliography, the bigger the reference list, the more you've read. The more research you've done, the more expansive your scholarship, and therefore the better case you're making that you're configuring an original contribution to knowledge. Because if you've read a lot, then you know what originality actually is. And I'm going to be brutal here. A short reference list shows laziness, unrepresentativeness, and yes, also a problem of level. So when I see a short reference list bibliography, it looks more like an honours dissertation or a coursework master's dissertation. So it signifies an issue or matter with level. Now, if we see a short bibliography reference list, we know you haven't done enough work. So aim to be big and aim to be comprehensive. Deal breaker 2. Crucial. Wow. The date of the references in the reference list. There are many reasons we try to move students through a PhD in 3 years. There are many reasons we do that. You get your life back. But the other reason we do this is the longer your candidature goes, the more dated your reference list appears. And can I say, this is a huge issue. In long candidatures, I read the examiner's reports, and invariably, in the long candidatures, and of course the examiners don't know it's a long candidature, but invariably the dated reference list is mentioned as a profound problem. So it's so common to see this, it is actually a thing. And the problem is, if you've got a dated reference list, you can't prove your original contribution to knowledge, because originality springs from the now, springs from the present. Yes, it's based on the past, but obviously if it's original, you've got to prove it's original right now on this planet, not original 5 or 10 years ago, okay? So what happens is, if you've got a long candidature and you're not keeping reading, your research looks tired. And the literature review is obviously dated. So you don't know what's going on in the field. And if you don't know what's going on in the field, examiners will show that to you. I always say to my students, and my fields are obviously quite different from a lot of yours, but I always aim to have at least 1/5 of my references from my students from the last 2 years. 1/5 from the last 2 years. Your discipline might be different, but in my disciplines, that's what we're aiming for. And just to give you an example of how I continue this practice, I had an article accepted last week. Now, I sent it out to the journal in 2017. It's now 2018. So what I did at 8 o'clock yesterday morning was go into Google Scholar and look at the most up-to-date reading that's emerged in the last 4 months. So when I'm making the final review and editing today for this article, I'm incorporating that research from 2018. So when that article appears later in the year, it is shiny and bright as a button. So it's a good practice to get into in terms of wider research careers as well. Deal breaker 3, here it is. Maybe I should have started with this one, but incorrect referencing. When I see incorrect referencing, I see a PhD student that doesn't know how to reference, then I see that they have no understanding of academic protocols and academic literacies. I fail a first year assignment if there are referencing errors. I fail a PhD if there are referencing errors. There's simply no way back from that fundamental error. If you can't reference, then you lack a fundamental academic skill. Okay, deal breaker 4. Inconsistent referencing. Now this one simply makes me crazy. So this is someone that can't quite decide what referencing style they're using. So they're moving often between Harvard and one of the footnoting styles, Chicago or MLA. And it's just stunning to me. It's like, decide on a reference style, because moving between the styles just really demonstrates clumsiness and you don't know what you're doing. So pick a style, be consistent, stay with it, demonstrate you know how to use it well. Okay, deal breaker 5, awkwardly positioned references. So a particular characteristic that exists in the Harvard referencing style, we see it less, I would argue, in disciplines with footnoting, because footnoting has a different relationship between reference and text, I would argue. But we see this in Harvard referencing, where a student simply often paraphrases stuff or presents a paragraph or a few sentences and then just puts a bracketed reference at the end of it. So the examiner can't really see any relationship at all between the sentences and the paragraph you have constructed and that positioning of the Harvard reference. So fewer things make me crazier than seeing a Harvard bracketed reference at the end of a paragraph and I can't see the relationship between that reference and indeed that paragraph. So it is important that you explain your references and that you interpret your references. Again, that is an academic skill. References must never, ever, ever be allowed to speak for themselves. Okay. Oh yes, here we go. Deal breaker 6. The blind spot bibliography. This problem emerges again in that first reading of the reference list of the bibliography that examiners do. So what we see is that particular scholars or researchers are emphasised over others. So we see particular scholars are very, very heavily used in the bibliography and other key scholars are not. So that's the blind spot bibliography. So what we see here are the obsessions of either the student or the supervisor that are focused on one particular method, one particular theory, one particular scholar. So we see particularly inexperienced supervisors create this type of environment for their students. So basically the scholar they're terribly interested in, they introduce the student to, and that's great, but you need to be introducing the full suite of academic interests and research rather than just simply a blind spot. So unfortunately in these circumstances, we've got supervisors who drag students into their obsession. And of course, we as examiners, we want balance. We're very happy for you to say this scholar is incredibly important. That's great. That's what you should be doing. But you also need to put that scholar in context. Why have you made that selection of scholar or method or theory, and what other options were available to you? So what alternatives were available? Why did you make that selection? So justify that. So we see this problem emerging in your reference list, and often the proxy for it is the name that's a big name that's quite obsessive in the bibliography or reference list was big about 5 years or 10 years or 20 years ago. And what we're seeing is debates have moved on, and yet the bibliography reference list has not moved on. So we're seeing that focus on that particular scholar, say, and no other scholar that's critiqued that person in the last decade. So again, that's a sign that something seriously is going wrong with the research here. So that's when we see that almost cultish focus on a theory or a method, and that's a problem. So what I want you to do is make the argument, don't assume the argument. So if you're focusing on particular methods or theories or tropes, that's great, but don't just assume that we all agree with you, because we don't. Make the case, make the argument, justify your decision and your choices. Deal breaker 7, new one really from the last 10 years or so, a lack of diversity in your source material. There's never been more information, high quality information, that exists right now in scholarship. It is such an amazing time to be alive. It is such an amazing time, such a privilege to be a researcher and a scholar when we have so much incredible information around us. But it is interesting that we've got such a diversity of sources and materials now, a diversity of platforms. So I'm looking to see that diversity, that multimodality, if you will, in the bibliography or reference list of students that I'm examining. So if I don't see that diversity, it means the student is lacking particular information literacy skills. So if I see, for example, in some disciplines, just a domination of scholarly monographs, so books, I see in other disciplines a domination of a few journals, so lots and lots of articles from very, very few journals. Or if I look down the list, for example, and it's all black, or it's all blue. So what that means is it's all analog, so it's all in black text, or it's all in blue hypertext. So it's all come from the online environment. So what I'm after is I'm after a mix of analog and digital, So it shows that you're actually able to align all the different platforms on which research exists, but also using podcasts, videos, conference proceedings. And of course you get a lot of points from me by using grey literature. If you found the interesting, the quirky, the unusual, that really impresses an examiner. So these types of sources show completeness, they show your rigour, they show your information literacy, and also your capacity to work with multimodal research. So again, aim for that diversity. Think about what that diversity looks like. Okay, deal breaker 8, Eurocentrism. This is a biggie for me, and in some ways it is sort of linked in with that academic blind spot issue we talked about earlier. And of course, this is really a blind spot. It might be more of a black spot, with the many meanings of that word as well. So this is where we see in the bibliography the focus on US, Canadian and British scholars to the detriment of the rest of the planet, ignoring the rest of the world where the bulk of the population and the bulk of the universities actually are. So as you can see, neo-colonialism lives in universities, it certainly lives in academic publishing, and therefore I give major credit to the students who have sought out the new voices, the new views, the new journals. So the Directory of Open Access Journals is particularly great for opening us out to new knowledges and new universities, and multiple languages, even if they are in translation. As I always say, it's a big, glorious, magnificent scholarly world out there, and that world is so much larger than Europe and North America. So start to show me that in your bibliography. 9, deal breaker 9, the warped perspective. The point of research is transparency, rigour, repeatability, accountability. Now these goals are undermined if your bibliography reference list is warped into a particular direction. You've often heard me say what we don't talk about is often more important than what we do. And I always remember the legendary Bruno Latour in a great book, Science in Action. And I was lucky, I read Science in Action when I was in my late teens. And it really did transform how I think about knowledge and how I think about the writing of knowledge. And Latour stated, quote, "The presence or the absence of references, quotations and footnotes is so much a sign of whether or not a document is serious or not, that you can transform, I love this, a fact into a fiction and a fiction into a fact by just adding or subtracting references," end of quote. How remarkable is that? I was so lucky that I read that so early in my career. So that means how we cut up, how we erase literature, how we include footnotes, or we decide not to, tells us a lot about our ethics as a researcher. So if you intentionally or indeed unintentionally skew your references, examiners will see it. And we always summon Latour, because when you make decisions about references, you're also making decisions about whether something is a fact or a fiction, or a fiction or a fact. I've often described the examination of PhDs as a dark art, and it really is. But what a recent study showed by Golding et al. In the journal Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education, great piece, is that although examiners approach every single thesis wanting it to pass, the speed at which that decision alters is simply remarkable. And what these scholars show too, remarkable in this analysis actually, that when an examiner finds referencing errors, they suddenly read the entire thesis much more critically. So when they see a strong bibliography reference list, all the references are in place, they relax and enjoy the research. When they find referencing errors and bibliographical errors, they tense up and they think, if that's a problem, what else am I going to find here? So, what I'd ask is you watch these variables. This is in your control. You know what we're looking for. These are the 9 deal breakers. Make sure that the examiners do not find those deal breakers, and you will smoothly sail through the examination process for your PhD. And please, as always, contact me if I can help in any way to, again, smooth your passage through what is a very stressful, very complex, very difficult examination process. So thank you for hanging with me for this information literacy trilogy, and I wish you love, light, and peace. Tia.